Mr. Hill, what has television given you?
Well, nervous dyspepsia, indigestion, heartburn.
For nearly 4 decades, one man made the entire world laugh. Not just Britain, the entire world. At its peak, Benny Hill's show was broadcast in over 140 countries, pulling in more than 21 million viewers in the United Kingdom alone on a single night. Children quoted his catchphrases. Grandmothers hummed his theme tune. American networks lined up to air his specials. He was, by almost every measurable standard, one of the most successful comedians television had ever produced. And then, almost overnight, it was gone. No grand farewell special. No tearful final bow. Just a quiet cancellation letter from Thames Television in 1989, and the sudden silence where that familiar music used to play. For millions of fans, it felt inexplicable. How does a show that popular simply disappear? How does a man that beloved become, within just a few years, a symbol of everything wrong with television comedy? The answer involves a changing culture, a fiercely public attack from a fellow comedian, a beauty pageant sketch that lit the fuse, and a television network that ultimately decided the controversy wasn't worth the fight anymore. This is the full story of how the Benny Hill show came crashing down, and why the ending was a long time coming. To understand what happened in 1989, you have to understand what Benny Hill built in the decades before it. Alfred Hawthorne Hill was born on January 21, 1924, in Southampton, England, into a family that had entertainment running quietly through its veins. His grandfather had been a circus clown, though his father had taken a more practical turn, managing a surgical appliance shop. From an early age, young Alfred seemed to absorb the contradiction, the showman's instinct wrapped inside an ordinary, working-class life. His path into entertainment was anything but direct. Before he became famous, he worked at Woolworths, delivered milk, operated a bridge, drove vehicles, and played drums in small venues. These weren't wasted years. Every job, every interaction, every ordinary human being he encountered became raw material. Hill had an extraordinary ability to observe people, their vanities, their frustrations, their small humiliations, and translate those observations into comedy that felt universally recognizable. His real education in performance came during World War II, when he was called up for military service in 1942. He trained as a mechanic with the Royal Electrical and Mechanical Engineers and was deployed to Normandy in September 1944, one of the most significant and dangerous theaters of the entire war. He served as a truck driver and searchlight operator, work that required precision, composure, and the ability to function under extraordinary pressure. Before the war ended, he transferred to the Combined Services Entertainment Division, where he performed for troops and truly began to understand what it meant to hold an audience. Comedy under those conditions, tired soldiers, uncertain futures, the weight of wartime, demanded something real. Hill learned that lesson well. After the war, he made his way steadily through the entertainment industry, taking his stage name Benny as a tribute to his hero, the American comedian Jack Benny, whose deadpan timing he deeply admired. He made his radio debut on Variety Bandbox in October 1947, and his sharp, adaptable wit quickly earned him a following. By 1950, he had moved to television, which was still a novelty for most British households, and the visual dimension opened up entirely new possibilities for his comedy.
The Benny Hill Show premiered on the BBC on January 15, 1955, and it announced itself immediately as something different. Hill combined the warmth and energy of British music hall tradition with the new intimacy of television. He used the camera not just as a passive observer but as a participant in his comedy. Close-ups that caught the glint in his eye, rapid cuts that amplified the absurdity of a situation, pre-recorded segments that allowed for elaborate visual gags impossible to stage live. His humor leaned on slapstick, wordplay, double entendres, and sharp parody, and it connected across generations with remarkable consistency. What made the show work was not just Hill's performance, though that was central, but the community he built around it. Collaborators like Dave Freeman helped shape the material through the 50s and early 60s. Patricia Hayes brought genuine character acting to her roles. Jackie Wright, the small, bald-headed actor who became a fan favorite by stoically enduring Hill's infamous head-slapping routines, gave the show one of its most beloved recurring dynamics. Wright's perfect straight-man timing made Hill's exaggerated reactions funnier by contrast. It was a proper comedy ensemble, not simply a vehicle for one ego. In 1969, The show made a pivotal move from the BBC to Thames Television, and this transition transformed its scale entirely. Rather than weekly episodes, the new format featured hour-long specials, giving Hill far more room to develop elaborate sketches, musical numbers, and visual comedy sequences of genuine ambition. The production values rose significantly. The writing became more layered. And the audience responded. Those viewing figures that climbed toward 21 million were a product of this era, when the Thames version of the show was at the absolute height of its powers. International success followed almost inevitably. The show was broadcast in over 140 countries, and its combination of physical comedy and universal human situations crossed language barriers with remarkable ease. In the United States, it was syndicated nationally and received Emmy Award nominations for Outstanding Variety in both 1980 and 1981. In 1972, Hill received the BAFTA Television Award for Best Writer, recognition that he was not simply a performer but a genuine craftsman of comedy. The Rose d'Or Award in 1984 added to a collection of honors that reflected a career of genuine and sustained achievement. As the show moved into the 1980s, it evolved in ways that, in retrospect, contained the seeds of its own undoing. One of the most significant additions was the introduction of a dance troupe of attractive young women who became known as Hill's Angels. They were talented performers. Sue Upton, one of the original Angels, was a genuine comedic presence in her own right, and Jane Leeves, who would later become internationally famous as Daphne on the American sitcom Frasier, got her early television experience as one of the Angels. Their inclusion gave the show a new visual energy and a fresh dynamic that audiences responded to warmly. But the Angels also intensified a tension that had always existed within the show's identity. Hill's comedy had always featured women prominently, and not always in ways that framed them as equals. The classic chase sequences that ended each episode, those frenetic, speeded-up runs through parks and corridors set to the bouncing rhythm of Yankee sax, almost always included scantily clad women being pursued by Hill and various other characters. The undercranking technique that made the footage run at accelerated speed gave the whole thing a cartoonish, exaggerated quality that Hill and his defenders argued removed it entirely from anything resembling reality. It was broad, physical, visual absurdism in the tradition of silent film comedy.
Whether that argument was convincing depended enormously on when you were watching and what assumptions you brought to it. In the 1960s, when the show was finding its voice, the sketches sat comfortably within mainstream entertainment norms. By the early 1970s, when viewership was at its peak, there were already beginning to be questions, but the sheer scale of the audience suggested the comedy was reaching people in the way Hill intended. By the mid-1980s, however, British culture had shifted in ways that made those same sketches look considerably different to a growing number of viewers, critics, and industry figures. The beauty pageant sketch that many point to as a particular flashpoint in this evolution aired in the late 1980s and captured everything that critics found troubling about the show's approach. The sketch featured Hill presiding over a parody beauty competition, with women presented primarily as objects for visual appraisal, the humor built around their appearance and the leering attention directed toward them. It was not subtle, and it was not trying to be. But where an earlier generation might have read it as harmless exaggeration, a new generation of viewers and television professionals read it as a straightforward expression of contempt dressed up as comedy. The sketch didn't just offend people in isolation, it crystallized a much broader discomfort that had been building for years. The most damaging public attack on the show came not from a regulatory body or a newspaper editorial but from another comedian. Ben Elton, who had made his name through the alternative comedy movement and the television program Saturday Live, was one of the most prominent voices of a new generation that saw itself as consciously different from the comedy traditions that had preceded it. Elton was sharp, politically engaged, and deeply invested in the idea that comedy had social responsibilities, that what you laughed at said something meaningful about who you were and what you believed. His accusations against the Benny Hill show were serious and publicly stated. In both a television appearance on Saturday Live and in the January 1987 issue of Q magazine, Elton argued that the show contributed to a culture in which women felt unsafe in public spaces. He suggested that the program's persistent portrayal of women as objects of pursuit and targets of physical humor reinforced attitudes that had real consequences beyond the television screen. It was a significant escalation, moving from criticism of taste or quality to an argument about harm. The response was fierce and divided. Supporters of Hill, and there were many, rejected Elton's logic with considerable force. A writer in The Independent described the attack as resembling the sight of an elderly uncle being brutalized by younger aggressors, suggesting that whatever the show's flaws, the viciousness of the assault was disproportionate. GQ magazine took a similarly skeptical line, pointing out the fundamental absurdity of tracing complex social problems back to the content of a television comedy program, comparing the argument to holding concert pianists responsible for completely unrelated harms elsewhere in the world. These weren't simply defensive reactions. They represented a genuine intellectual position that the causal link Elton claimed existed was far too simplistic to take seriously. What made the whole episode stranger in retrospect was that Ben Elton later appeared to partly acknowledge the excess of his own position. In the comedy series Harry Enfield and Chums, he participated in a sketch in which he was portrayed as a character named Benny Elton, a caricature of himself as an overzealous, humor-suppressing, politically correct enforcer. In a moment of genuine comedy, the sketch ended with this character being chased by angry women to the tune of Yachty Sax. It was an admission, however comic in form, that the righteousness had perhaps outrun the wisdom. The Broadcasting Standards Council weighed in as well, with a spokesman noting that public perception of what constituted acceptable humor had shifted meaningfully, and that content once considered cheeky entertainment was now being viewed through an entirely different lens by a significant portion of the audience. This was an important observation because it located the problem not in some absolute standard but in a changing cultural conversation. The same sketches, the same jokes, the same chase sequences, but a different audience with different expectations and different sensitivities. Thames Television was watching all of this carefully. The network had benefited enormously from Hill's work. He had reportedly generated £26 million for the company over the course of his time there, much of it driven by the extraordinary success of the American syndication deal. But by the late 1980s, the financial calculation was changing. Viewership was declining as audience tastes shifted and the television landscape became more competitive. The production costs were substantial. Each episode was reportedly costing approximately £450,000, a figure that represented serious exposure for a show whose audience numbers were no longer what they had been at the peak. The controversy amplified the financial concern rather than standing apart from it. Advertisers care about public perception, and a show that had become the focal point of a national debate about sexism in media was a less comfortable proposition for commercial sponsors than it had once been. The combination of falling ratings, rising costs, and the reputational pressure of the ongoing controversy gave Thames Television executives a set of reasons to act that went beyond any single factor. In late May 1989, Benny Hill and Thames Television parted ways after 21 years. The show that had made both of them famous, that had reached over 140 countries and earned recognition on multiple continents, was simply over. There was no definitive announcement of a final episode, no acknowledgement in the scheduling that something was ending. The show just stopped, and the silence that followed was its own kind of statement. What happened to Hill in the years after the cancellation was painful to observe for those who cared about his work. He was not a man who handled rejection or irrelevance gracefully, in part because he had never really developed the personal infrastructure that might have cushioned the blow. Despite his extraordinary financial success, his estate at the time of his death was valued at over £7.5 million. He had always lived modestly, renting rather than owning, buying cheap food from supermarkets, walking rather than taking taxis, patching his clothes rather than replacing them. These habits were not performance or eccentricity. They were simply who he was, a working-class man from Southampton who never quite believed that the wealth and fame were permanent. He had never married. 2 women had declined his proposals over the years, and he had kept his personal life intensely private, rarely discussing relationships in public. He lived largely alone, and when the work that had defined him for decades was suddenly absent, there was not a great deal else to fill the space. He attempted a new project, Benny Hill's World Tour, in 1991, which was intended to showcase his comedy in locations around the world where the original show had found its audience. The project ran into difficulties, and only a single special, titled Greetings from New York, was completed. It was later released on DVD and described as his final television appearance, a modest, somewhat melancholy ending to a career of genuinely spectacular achievement. His health deteriorated through the early 1990s. He suffered a mild heart attack in February 1992, after which doctors recommended bypass surgery. He declined. A week later he was diagnosed with kidney failure, and he declined dialysis treatment as well. He continued to live independently in his flat in Teddington, alone, in the way he had always preferred. On the morning of April 20, 1992, he died in his armchair while watching television. His body was not discovered until 2 days later, when concerned friends and colleagues could not reach him by telephone. He was 68 years old, and the cause of death was recorded as coronary thrombosis. A new television contract from Central Independent Television arrived at his home on the same day he died, a detail of almost unbearable timing. He was buried at Hollybrook Cemetery in Southampton, near where he had been born, on April 28, 1992. The story of what The Benny Hill Show became after its cancellation is in many ways as interesting as the story of what it was during its run. For a period in the late 1980s and through much of the 1990s, the show existed in British cultural memory primarily as an example of what comedy should not be, a relic of attitudes about women that the culture had moved beyond, a museum piece of sexism wrapped in slapstick. Comedians of the alternative generation positioned themselves in explicit contrast to what Hill had represented. Critics used the show as a convenient shorthand for everything crude and regressive about pre-feminist television entertainment. But time has a way of complicating the simple narratives. In November 2021, the channel That's TV announced that The Benny Hill Show would be returning to nationwide British television for the first time in nearly 2 decades, included in a Christmas schedule alongside other beloved classics from the ITV archive. The announcement generated genuine excitement among viewers who had grown up with the show, and a notably warm response even from younger audiences encountering it properly for the first time. The laughter, it turned out, had not aged as badly as the controversy had suggested it would. This is not an argument that the criticisms were without foundation. Cultural attitudes genuinely did change, and some of what the show produced sits uncomfortably in the light of those changes. The beauty pageant sketch and others like it reflected assumptions about women and comedy that many people, then and now, find objectionable. These are real conversations worth having. What the revival suggested, though, was that the show was more than those moments, that Hill's skill as a physical comedian, his extraordinary range as a writer and performer, his gift for parody and wordplay and timing, these things had a value that the controversy had temporarily obscured. Hill received the BAFTA for Best Writer in 1972 not as a courtesy but because his writing was genuinely excellent. The sketches he built, the characters he created, Fred Scuttle with his peculiar mannerisms and saluting gesture, the hapless everyman figures stumbling through absurd situations, these were crafted with real intelligence and care. The international success of the show was not an accident or a product of low standards. Humor that translates across 140 countries and survives the language barrier is doing something right at a fundamental level of human connection. What the story of The Benny Hill Show ultimately demonstrates is how completely a cultural moment can reshape the meaning of something that previously seemed stable. The show did not change between 1971, when 21 million people were watching it, and 1989, when Thames Television decided it was no longer viable. The sketches were the same sketches. The chase sequences were the same chase sequences. Yakety Sax was the same piece of music it had always been. What changed was the world watching it, and the standards by which it was being judged, and the voices that were now powerful enough to define the terms of the debate. Ben Elton's attack was influential not simply because he was persuasive but because it arrived at exactly the moment when the institutions that mattered, the television networks, the advertising community, the regulatory bodies, were already looking for a way to process their own discomfort with material that had once seemed unproblematic. The beauty pageant sketch gave that discomfort a specific target. The public debate gave it momentum. The financial pressures gave Thames Television a practical reason to act on what the cultural atmosphere was already suggesting. For Benny Hill himself, the ending was cruel in its abruptness. He spent the final years of his life without the work that had given his existence its shape and purpose, and he died alone, in his armchair, in a modest flat in Teddington, on the same day that someone in television decided they wanted him back. The contract that arrived too late is perhaps the detail that captures the whole story most completely, the recognition that came just after the moment when it could still have mattered.